When people hear that the condo inventory is rising in Vancouver, the assumption is simple. The market is slowing down. But the reality is a lot more nuanced than that because Vancouver doesn't just have more inventory, it has more of a very specific type of inventory. Units that were designed for a buyer who no longer dominates the market. And to understand that, we need to go back to how condos were actually built and sold. And we're going back at least 12 years between 2014 and 2021. The market was optimized for investors, and during that period, the best customer in the condo market was not the end user like you're seeing today. It was the investor, and developers weren't designing homes primarily how people lived. They were designing product for how investors calculated returns. That meant prioritizing things like easy to rent layouts, the lowest entry possible price point wise, maximum price per square foot, and units that were easy to resell later to potentially other investors. So the product pipeline started to look almost like a factory. More studios, then you had more micro one bedrooms, more narrow layouts, and more no den boxes. And that model worked extremely well as long as appreciation covered every flaw in the design. But in 2026, appreciation is no longer doing all the heavy lifting, which means the weaknesses in those layouts are suddenly much more visible. The FOMO era accelerated the micro unit boom as well. There's another layer to this that doesn't get talked about enough, and that's the psychology driving the market during the last cycle. During roughly between, I'd say, 2016 to 2021, the dominant emotion in Vancouver real estate wasn't caution. It was FOMO, fear of missing out. Buyers, they weren't asking, hey, is this unit, like, is this a good unit? They were asking, if I don't buy something now, will I be permanently priced out of Vancouver forever? Is this my window right now that I need to get in? And that was that herd mentality. And when that mindset takes over a market, something very predictable starts to happen. Buyers start compromising on the fundamentals, especially when it comes to the size and the layout. This is exactly when we started seeing the rise of the micro product. Units under 500 square feet became common. Narrow one bedrooms with minimal separation. Studios now marketed very clever as junior one bedrooms, and many of these sold extremely well at the time. But not because they were the most livable product. They sold because buyers believed just getting into the market in any form, that was priority. When we look back at the ownership data, the story becomes even clearer. You look at Stats Canada found that roughly almost 59% of condos under 600 square feet were investor owned, compared to only about 38% of units that were over 800 square feet. So the pipeline didn't just tilt towards the smaller units, it tilted heavily toward investor driven product. And look, that matters because investors behave very differently from the way end users behave. Investor demand is much more sensitive to things like interest rates, what their carrying costs are, how rent growth is happening year over year, and resale liquidity. And in the current market, pressure is building in several of those areas all at once. Let's switch it over to the investor math. So interest rates are part of the story, but they're not the only factor. So the real shift comes from several costs stacking on top of each other. So you got carrying costs have increased, right? Strata fees have risen significantly year over year. Insurance costs, same thing. And maintenance costs are obviously getting higher and higher. And rent growth isn't rescuing cash flow the way it did in the last cycle. At the same time, tenants have become more selective. There's more vacancy, right? So now many want more space. They want a work from home setup and layouts that feel functional day to day. And that makes these micro units, these 400 square foot, 500 square foot, harder to rent and harder to justify financially. Strata fees became part of the mortgage. Another shift that buyers are paying attention to now is monthly overhead. A decade ago, strata fees were often treated like background noise. But in 2026, buyers looked at strata fees as part of the housing payment. So, for example, 650 square foot one bedroom with a 650 monthly strata fee starts to feel very different to an end user buyer because psychologically it becomes money that they never recover. And that's why some older buildings with simpler amenities and lower fees are starting to compete very well against newer buildings with expensive common areas. So over the last decade, developers competed heavily on amenities, right? Buildings started including these larger gyms, concierge services, maybe co-working spaces, air conditioning systems, luxury lounges, and elaborate common areas, that you could rent out for a party or whatever. But these features, look, they photograph beautifully in marketing materials, but over time they also translate into higher strata fees, higher maintenance costs, and greater insurance exposures as well. So more end users today are choosing something very different, right? They're looking at more simpler buildings. They're going to look at their unit and they don't worry about the amenities, right? They want to see a strong contingency fund. They want to see lower monthly overheads over a luxury building with a lot of expensive moving parts. So again, what is the typical end user actually wanting right now? The biggest shift in the market is happening at the buyer preference level. So post COVID, look, people didn't just change where they work, they changed their definition of what a livable home actually looked like. So today's buyer prioritizes things that they weren't prioritizing before. They're prioritizing function over finish. They want a bedroom that fits a real bed and side tables, not can we fit a double in here possibly, right? They want something that this is an actual bedroom, right? Closets that actually store things, a workspace that's not your kitchen counter, a dining area that fits more than bar stools around an island, right? And separation between rooms, and ideally some kind of usable outdoor space. What they're increasingly avoiding are layouts like long, narrow bowling alley units. We saw those a lot, right? The kitchen on one side of the wall, the couch that maybe just fits like, 2 feet behind that, and you call that a living room, right? People are avoiding those types of layouts. That's not a layout that's popular right now. They don't want those bedrooms with sliding glass walls and then they call that a bedroom separate. They want a real wall. Dens that could fit a desk. So when we saw these micro units, they only fit a very specific lifestyle. And this is the key shift. In 2026, buyers aren't just buying finishes anymore. They're buying a floor plan that can survive real life. Let's look at one bedrooms that are under more pressure. When we look at the actual sales data, the patterns really start to show up across several Vancouver submarkets, right? One bedrooms currently have higher inventory relative to sales than a two bedroom. For example, I'll pull up the charts here. So if we look at one bedroom sales in the month, this prior month, one bedroom inventory 238, 26 sales, months of inventory about 9.2, months, two bedrooms 107, sales 16, months of inventory about 6.7 months. So yeah, one beds are still selling, but relative to supply, they're clearly under more pressure. And the simple reason is this: one bedrooms often behave like commodity products. Buyers can compare 10 very similar units, same building, same layout, same finishes, which gives buyers a ton of negotiation power, a lot of leverage. But when a functional two bedroom or a true one plus den that lives like a two hits the market, there are usually fewer substitutes, and that keeps demand a little bit stronger. So what about this shift? Like, is it going to reverse quickly, or is this sort of the new way of living? So look, even if interest rates ease, which they have eased, and that's the thing, we're sort of steady with the interest rates. We kind of know where we stand for at least the rest of this year, it sounds like, and potentially into 2027 with the potential of a little bit of an increase. So interest rates are what they are. That's not what's going to shift the market at all. So the rates they're not going to necessarily mean we see a big shift back towards a micro unit demand, because underlying issues are structural, not just financial. There is simply a lot of similar product in the market. And end user preferences have shifted towards space and functionality. And a poor layout doesn't age like a charming character house that a lot of people desire. it ages more like technology, right? So a small box with no separation becomes less desirable over time because buyers can compare it to better designed alternatives. So when headlines say inventory is rising in Vancouver, we have record inventory. The real question isn't just how much inventory we have. It's what kind of inventory is building up. You have to look at those specifics because the units that were optimized for a FOMO driven investor cycle are now competing in a market led much more by end user decision making. And those two buyer value very different things. In the FOMO era, getting into the market, that was enough. Just get your foot in the door. But in 2026, the unit actually has to work. So if you guys are in the market for a one bedroom or two bedroom and you want me to break down the right type of unit that has the demand and might have a good exit strategy if you're looking to move up in a few years, make sure you shoot me a DM. You can message me. All my links are in the description. But again, guys, I appreciate you making it to the end of this video, and I'll see you guys on the next one.